All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this Lemon Legacies Porch Talk. My name is Sarah Thomas. I'm the Associate Director of the Lemon Project, and I want to thank you all for being here for what remains using cadaver dogs to help locate burial grounds. So I want to just, since we have a lot of people from all around, I want to talk about briefly, I want to mention why these conversations are named Lemon's Legacies. Lemon was a man who was enslaved by William and Mary in the 18th century. And with these porch talks, we aim to create a space of listening, gathering together, and having conversations as we move towards reconciliation and healing. Thank you so much to Kat Warren for joining us tonight. I want to also thank Terry Myers, a big supporter of the Lemon Project, for providing the introductions that got this conversation going for us. Before we move forward with introducing Kat Warren, I would like to ask the Lemon Project postdoctoral research associate, Dr. Joanne Johnson, to read William Mary's land acknowledgement statement.
Thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. William and Mary acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of our lands, on our campuses on today. The Chirinhakanataway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansman, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members past and present. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I'll now introduce Kat Warren. She is a New York Times bestselling author of What the Dog Knows: Scent, Science, and the Amazing Ways Dogs Perceive the World. This book tells the story of learning to work with her impossible young shepherd as a cadaver dog to find the missing and dead. It won critical acclaim and was longlisted for the PEN E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. The Young Readers edition of What the Dog Knows was published in October 2019. Kat grew up in Oregon and worked as a newspaper journalist for many years across the United States. She recently retired as a professor from North Carolina State University, but still writes, teaches, and lectures. She lives with her husband and their large German Shepherd in Durham, North Carolina. And before we get into the presentation, I want to mention that we will be taking questions in the chat. So please share any questions and comments that you have for Kat Warren, and we'll be moderating a question and answer period with her after the presentation. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Kat.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Joanne, for that really lovely land acknowledgement. As we've talked about, that we're starting to hear them, and really they are meaningful. And I'm really honored to have been invited to do this presentation for Lemon's Legacies and the Porch Talk. And one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit about, which is a kind of acknowledgement in its own right, as we move into this talk about cadaver dogs, is that there are things that I'm not. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a historian. I'm not a genealogist. I'm a journalist and now happily retired professor. I love scent detection dogs. Love, love, love them. That's why I'm giving this talk. But before I talk about what I think is a really wonderful use of scent detection dogs, which is to help locate lost burial grounds, I think it's important to recognize the misuse of dogs. During slavery, dogs were used to track and terrorize the enslaved. During the civil rights era, law enforcement dogs were used to attack peaceful protesters. That misuse still continues. A Department of Justice investigation in Ferguson, Missouri, of that police department after George Floyd's death found that police there used their canines exclusively against Black individuals, often not to counter a physical threat, but to inflict punishment. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And then the second thing I want to acknowledge is that I really think that well-trained cadaver dogs are a marvelous and unique tool to do this work, to locate lost burial sites. But it's important not to make dogs' noses into something sort of magical or mysterious. And I think it's really important not to overstate what their role is here, because almost every effort to find lost cemeteries has community activists, organizers, descendants of slaves and sharecroppers trying to learn their own history, and all the historians, archaeologists, geophysicists, and genealogists who make up part of this work. And so when I talk tonight, it's really going to be talking about dogs as a kind of really important, but as a complement to this work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's just assume that this is all going to go beautifully, smoothly. And what do we see? Do we see the slide there?
Yes.
Super. Okay, so let me launch into a little bit about this talk. The first half of this presentation, I'm going to talk about sort of cadaver dogs in general and a little bit about what we know about them and their role generally. And then the second half, I'm going to move into talking about the work detecting African-American burial grounds. And and what the challenges are for this kind of work, what really happens. So this is Solo. His face still makes me smile. He was the reason I got into this work. He really changed our lives. And he was named Solo, very not imaginatively, because my husband loves jazz. And he was a singleton. He was the only pup in his litter. And those of you familiar with dogs may know that singletons are really capable of being jerks, right? They've never learned to speak dog language with other dogs. So we had a dog who really thought that he shouldn't have to share this planet with other dogs, although he loved people and he was super smart and he had a good nose. And I had never been interested in dogs' noses, but he made me interested. And I took him to a trainer and said, what do I do? Right? A dog, aggressive dog. And she sort of looked at him and said, he's just a jackass. Why don't you train him as a cadaver dog? And she explained what that was and what my role would be as a handler. And I thought, wow, well, that is interesting. And so literally with the help of so many wonderful trainers who mostly had to teach me, they had less to teach Solo, who was, I have to say, so sort of resilient to my mistakes and everything. And for 8 years, we worked together searching for the missing and the dead. And what I want to do now is I'm going to show a really brief video just to show, if for those of you who may not have seen scent dog work a lot, sort of how it works. And with the proviso that all dogs are different, all dogs work scent differently. That's part of the joy of watching them work. So let me get this started and I'll just narrate. So here's Solo. He's working off lead. And basically there's training material out here. And his job is to find it. He's not tracking anybody back to the material. He's trying to scent the scent of human remains. And you'll see him come down towards the river here. This is in Durham. And you'll see him kind of pause and kind of hitch. And he smelled a training aid that I had put down close to the river. And he went down to alert on it. But one of the things that he trains on, and it's kind of a demonstration of the potential, it's his teeth. I have a really wonderful dentist who donated a few teeth to me for his training. And I pop them there and let them kind of be there for 45 minutes or an hour. And what you'll see is he's hunting, and you'll see him hitch here. He's actually caught the scent of the teeth. And he comes in, and they're just on the other side of that little tree. My friend Sarah did this, and she's a really good videographer, so it's artistic. He puts his nose on them. He does what's called an alert or a final indication, where he lies down, which is his kind of cue to me that he's found what we're looking for. And then a game of tug. Dogs have to find this work rewarding or they're not going to do it. And he loved the hunt itself, but he really also loved games of tug. And here he found the stuff, and I was kind of slow. He trained himself to go back and find me and bring me back the material. So that's just one dog. You can see that. And, you know, she put me slow motion going out of the woods, which was really very nice. Okay, so what are these dogs detecting when they detect human remains? And I want to come back to this photo later on. You can see that there is basically that there is human skeletal remains here, and we'll talk about that. But dogs can find what they're trained to find. So it partly depends on what they're exposed to. Human decomposition is super, super complicated and fascinating to me. I mean, it's sort of a deep and broad subject. Things like as simple as adipocere, which is essentially the fat that we have on our bodies in certain environments, can survive for centuries. And bone, such as we see in here, or something like decomposition fluid, is really significant. So we're still trying to figure out all the organic compounds that are in human decomposition, plus all the volatile organic compounds that are there, because essentially the volatile is just the stuff that comes up into the air so that the dog's nose can snag that scent, right? And so 480 plus organic compounds, and maybe up to 80 volatile organic compounds. And human blood is another thing, although it's used more for forensic cases than it is for dogs who are, for instance, working on disasters. So this is the kind of search that Solo and I were called out on. We would do homicide cases, missing person cases, dementia, which was always, they're all sad, but the dementia cases were just super sad, suicides. And the reason I put this clip here is because it shows somebody who was a founder basically in the United States of this work. Andy Redmond was a Connecticut state policeman. His little dog Josie there was a dropout from a guide dog for the blind school. Andy got a bunch of dropouts from that school for his dogs because they were just a little too enthusiastic. They needed a little more calm. But Andy and Josie were on the hunt for the victims of a serial killer. There were 11 women who were addicted to drugs who went missing from just one block in New Bedford, Mass. And Andy and Josie found 3 of the victims. It was a search along highways all through Massachusetts. It was really, really difficult. So well-trained cadaver dogs are used every day very effectively worldwide in cases like this. And they're also used in disasters. So this is Raven. Marcy Koenig, who's a very experienced dog handler, deployed Raven at Ozo, and Ozo's in Washington. Some of you may remember it. It was a terrible mudslide. It essentially buried a small town, and mud was 70 feet deep. And I love this picture because it shows two things. It shows that it is super hard work. You can see Raven was often in mud clear up to her chest, but she's really happy. She helped recover people. The people who were on the site said that if it hadn't been for the dogs, it was a square mile of mud and 70 feet deep, that they wouldn't have known where to start digging for the victims if it hadn't been for the dogs. All 43 victims were recovered. So just one use. Here's another kind of disaster. This is the Camp Fire in 2018 in California. It was one of the early bad fires that gave everybody a clue what was to come in the West. And the Camp Fire was particularly tragic because the people in Paradise, the little town, many of them did not get warning. Those who were given warning, it wasn't urgent enough, and that fire just ripped across the top of the town. There were cars on roads that had to be searched for remains, and it was hot, difficult work. And here is a very experienced handler with her Malinois searching one of the vehicles. Another sad but really important use. This is Hunter. He's a golden retriever, and Deanna Hudgens is another super effective, excellent cadaver dog handler. I learned a lot from her, and this was Surfside condo collapse, and so many victims. And Deanna said that it was probably the hardest deployment she's ever done. It was heartbreaking. As a matter of fact, one of my family members lost friends in this collapse. But as she said, she was so proud of the work that Hunter did. And I think that you can see with this twisted rebar, I mean, it's just complicated work. And briefly, it's kind of nice to use this before we start talking about locating historic human remains, partly because dogs can be so effective on water, and water can be just a bear for being able to recover victims. And here in the Southeast, water is often not clear. There have been recoveries up to 200 feet and more on reservoirs. Bodies tend to move in places like reservoirs. There are currents. This is a training, not a deployment, which is why people look pretty happy there. The slab is learning how to work with scent coming up from this lake. And what the dogs do is essentially steer the boat. They actually move to one side of the boat or another if they start to smell scent. And you throw a buoy down when the dog says it's close to here. What can the dog do? The dog can help narrow down the area. And it's a little bit like that with historic human remains. So let's talk about what historic human remains looks like. And I do this picture partly because this is Dixie. She's a shepherd Malinois mix. She's an extremely experienced cadaver dog, as is her handler experienced, Lisa Higgins. And you go, okay, a dog alerting on a headstone, no big deal. This is from 1865. It is a really important part of this process that dogs have a chance to train and work at cemeteries like this, where there tend to be older stones and very often places where there are not stones. And you can see Dixie doing the same alert on this depression that's just outside where you would think that the burials stopped. And there were many unmarked burials. And scent can be really faint But dogs that are trained to search methodically and are trained on this faint scent can be one really important tool. And if you think about that depression there, this often happens in older burials, or what we call clandestine burials, which is when somebody has killed and buried somebody in a clandestine manner. And essentially what happens is that human decomposition works so that at a certain point, the soil collapses. The next step in something like this would be to do ground penetrating radar, right? To look at, see what kind of anomalies there are. But right now, I want to pop over to Croatia for a moment, because one of the reasons I love this work in Croatia is the degree to which it really moved the needle on our knowledge about cadaver dogs' ability to locate old and even ancient remains. So this is on the top of there's a hill fort. This is a necropolis. It overlooks the Adriatic. It's beautiful, but also sort of wind scoured and a bit brutal. The team of Vedrana Glavish has rebuilt some of these beehive tombs with the burial chests so that you can see what it looks like. So that very early picture I showed you of the skeletal remains, those were from one of these burial chests. And these were probably a pastoral people. And there were usually 3 or 4 bodies in these chests. As a kind of thought experiment, Vedrana Glavish contacted Andrea Pintar and her husband, Chris Nikolic, who both of whom are enormously knowledgeable with very experienced dogs. Their work standardly is, besides homicides and missing people, is that they look for sites of mass executions, going back to World War II, but also from the conflicts in the Balkans. So as you can sort of probably realize, it's enormously difficult work. And the dogs are trained to work very, very slowly, because sometimes farmers would use backhoes to bury people. So it could be really difficult to find with missing witnesses and everything else. Here in this necropolis, this is the radiocarbon dating showed that these skeletal remains were 2,700 years old. This was a beautiful little double-blind study. The folks are going to drop this into the chat if anybody wants the citation for the study that came out of this. But the fact is that it was double-blind work. The archaeologists, the handlers, the dogs, right, didn't know where these burial chests were. And it didn't look so pretty as it does now on the right, okay? It was just rubble. So you can see Panda working slowly. I can imagine it is such a beautiful view over the Adriatic. The limestone has, we speculate, held on to the scent of the deceased for nearly 3,000 years. And I contacted Ade Shun, who is a scent detection animal expert, because literally she works with giant pouched rats who do the mine work, and also with dogs. This is not easy work. And as she said, you can't replicate it. It can be difficult to train. So it's one of those things where you look at this work and you go, oh, dogs, and isn't that cool? But part of what is so cool about this work is how exacting and beautiful it is. And Vedrana and Andrea and Chris are still working together on archaeology projects. So, so back to the United States, and I could spend hours on this topic. I'm going to spend just a slide. We have our own ancient remains in the United States, where throughout the Southeast and into the Midwest, we had the equivalent of the pyramids of Egypt from the Mississippian era and earlier and later. And this is Susie Goodhope and her dog Shiraz. She has been working with the National Park Service, trying to locate some of these mounds that have been flattened and destroyed, partly often by things like suburbs, but also from the turn of the last century bad archaeology, where these were just dug to ground and grave goods were removed. And now, even though there may be a map of where it was, it's impossible to see. So one of the things that I do want to note is that we have something called NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which has helped archaeologists and others think really carefully about what it means to be non-invasive. And what I want to say about dogs doing this work is that it is a very sort of careful thing that the dogs do. They do not destroy sites. And I also want to say that disinterment, in other words, digging down, is simply not done anymore. And I think that it is also true that in thinking about historic remains, that it is going to be a rare case that that's going to happen. So, so now let's talk about African American burial grounds. They are all over the United States, throughout the Southeast. I went and pulled just a few fairly recent examples, and Susie and Lisa and their dogs worked at McGill Air Force Base in Tampa. Some of this work in Tampa is really bearing fruit, and we'll talk more about another couple of cases. Conroe in the lower left-hand corner is Conroe in Texas, where cadaver dogs helped define and sort of find the boundaries of a cemetery there. The Washington Post covered the Bilvoir Plantation, where descendants of slaves had done a ton of research at this plantation that relatives of Francis Scott Keys had, and they brought dogs in, and they've been doing work at the Bilvoir Plantation. Just above that is a picture that friend and colleague Blair Tormé, who's at Western Carolina University and a geologist, snapped pretty recently. Paul Miller is there, and that's a ground penetrating radar apparatus that's there. But this is a project in the Smoky Mountains and National Park to find and map slave and African American cemeteries in the Smoky Mountain National Park. So again, just a plethora of projects that are happening. Let me go to the next slide. Sadly, one of the things we have to think about is that private land is different from national park land. Much of this work is something that ends up stopping at a certain point. I was fortunate to be part of a training in West Virginia. Oral history put the burial of perhaps 6 enslaved people from this farm At the top of the hill that was probably at the top of the hill that was the former apple orchard. One of the things that one learns in researching these things is that even if there's only oral history, scholars of Appalachia note how brutal the lives of slaves were there, and particularly on this farm. And talking to the 92-year-old farmer, and this was passed down through oral history, so many of the children in Appalachian were sold into the Deep South, and it was now just this field. So working the dogs on this farm, the dogs worked across a pretty big, sort of several acres. 3 of these pictures are of Strega, who is an extraordinarily experienced cadaver dog. She deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, but she's done searches in West Virginia for many, many years. And one of the things that you'll see is that in that lower right-hand corner, she's at the bottom of the hill and there's a little pond there. And she started at the bottom of the hill and worked her way up the hill until she alerted there at the top of the hill. And one of the things that it tells you, of course, is that you have a water table where over tens of years, right, that scent is going to, and that decomposition is going to flow down with the water table, and there will be scent at the bottom. Strega worked her way up, and this is where she alerted, as did the other 4 dogs. That's Rocco in the lower left. He went on, he was fairly young there, but he went on to a really amazing career as a cadaver dog. And I think that one of the other things that when we look at this is that the farmer didn't want anything else done, right? So that was the end of it. And I think that that's part of the sort of the sadness of this. This is a fairly recent search in Maryland. This is a search that will probably move forward. I won't talk about the details of it because it's unspooling in its own way, but it's a plantation where there was no sign of a cemetery for the enslaved, completely overgrown, which is often the case in these. And one of the things that you think about when things like this happen is that the dogs are one part, right? And I'm going to talk about the dogs part. That here's Paul Martin with his dog Abby, and Kathleen Connor with her dog Seamus. And I just want to stipulate that Seamus is not being given Diet Coke as a break. He's being given water there. But when we talk about how to work dogs in this situation, these dogs are working separately. The handlers are not watching each other's dogs work. It's really important because there is this clever Hans effect that dogs are super good at reading our unconscious body language, and we don't know what we give away. So it's important that these be sort of independent searches. And this is the thing with faint scent, that it makes a difference what the temperature is, what the time of day is, where the humidity is, the barometric pressure. I mean, all of these things can play roles. So, and then there are all these tools, right? So when we talk about the dogs being a complement, some of the technology that you use with the dogs is important. So you can see there's a Garmin, which is basically the dog has a GPS collar. So wherever the dog is walking or running, that is going to be marked. And before each handler went out, the area that they were to search was sort of identified on the map. And you can kind of see, looking at that left-hand thing, where it looks like an overly enthusiastic toddler has gotten hold of it with their crayons. That's the area where the dogs slowed down and really started working, right? And you can kind of look at that and go, you can sort of see the areas where the dogs simply weren't as interested. But part of it too is that coming into this area before the dogs even searched is looking for signs, right? What do we have in the woods that might be a sign? And people who have done this research, I mean, everything, field stones, periwinkles, cedar posts, and then there's the ground penetrating radar and all the other kinds of things that you need that can really help. And you can see there, that's a shot of what the ground penetrating radar is showing, which is showing kind of a typical sign of graves, right? With those marks. But what you have is you need people who can really read that. And then, of course, not only are you putting all this data together, but then you're looking at the genealogy and the history, and community involvement is incredibly important, and being able to find descendants. And sometimes that happens before the dogs deploy. Sometimes it happens after. This history is so important to be able to even know where to search. Here's an example of work that really made a huge difference. And Kay McDonald is there at the right with her dog. And Kay was assistant city manager in Thomasville, Georgia. She was really interested in the history of a prison, Civil War prison site, where prisoners were kept for about 5 days, and many of them died. 5,000 prisoners from Andersonville prison were brought down and put in this temporary prison camp. You can see the trench that was dug. You can see a dog working there. Kay brought in Susie and Lisa Higgins. And then over the years, the next thing was to do ground penetrating radar. There was a historic African-American cemetery there, where it simply wasn't known what its boundaries were, surrounded by a pretty crappy cyclone fence, as you know, except that sometimes that's all you get, or you don't even get that. But what's beautiful is to watch the stages of these areas being recognized and understood. This is the Flipper Cemetery that now has a really good fence around it. And people are learning from both these sites, and a third site called the Old Cemetery. And it's sort of a marvelous, it's a kind of stone soup in a way, because it was really Kay who started this just because of her commitment to know more about the history of Thomasville. And with the historians there in Thomasville, it's a huge and wonderful project. Here's another sort of set of things that I want to show, because when I said earlier about the fact that it kind of takes a village, the fact is that activists very often have to push, right? So the later Hollinger, basically, this was a cemetery in Tallahassee that he had researched the history of and everything else, but it remained an unmarked cemetery. You see the quotes, right? And yet then that's in April 2019. By December 2019, that's Shiraz in the background alerting on the alerting near that tree. In the foreground, a National Park Service person is running GPR. They have located, I think, either 40 or 70, and I should know that, 40 unmarked graves. And so the next steps have been really interesting. So it's on a golf course at a country club, and then it moves into the woods. But the fact is now that this area is going to have a memorial set, and you can see that in the middle picture that they just sort of offered those up in the last, very recently. And then beyond that, the governor created a task force for the whole state of Florida, because Florida has many Black cemeteries, and Leon County is an area that was really the hub of Florida Plantation. As a matter of fact, at one time, 3 out of 4 people living in Leon County was enslaved. And so I'm going to note the irony that a governor who won't let the 1619 project be taught, and wants state colleges and universities to survey their students to see whether they've been indoctrinated into an anti-racist agenda, has signed on for this project to help locate the unmarked or lost cemeteries throughout Florida. And I think, as one of the people on the task force said, only in Florida. Welcome to Florida. So so I think that they have a January deadline. It's an enormous amount of work. I want to talk briefly about what else is happening, and I do want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions. So Jill Lepore just last month in the New Yorker did a pretty amazing long piece on the burial grounds of African Americans. It's long, it's complicated. I think this quote says a lot. And I think that what you start to realize when you look at this work is how vast it is, and how it's not going to happen overnight. If you think about the funding, finding places, it's not just under golf courses, it's under housing projects, highways that went through the middle of African American communities. We have Highway 147 that essentially destroyed a middle class African American community that we had in Durham, the city I live in. So, so there is lots of work to do. And one of the things that's important to talk about is that if we go back to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, there's discussion about whether something like that is needed. For African Americans, there are skeletal remains in museums and universities everywhere. how does this get funded? There are two really wonderful bills, one in the Senate and one in the House, that are at this point kind of sitting there, but basically to try to find burial grounds across the United States. And how that would happen, we don't know. My wonderful representative, Alma Adams, was co-sponsor of the bill in the House. But there are people who are not waiting for the Senate and the House to act. One of the wonderful things that's happening in Florida that's now become national is Professor Antoinette Jackson, who's an anthropologist at University of South Florida, just launched this website in June, and it is hugely ambitious. But I recommend any of you, because I know there are people out there who have cadaver dogs and who have done some of this work on cemeteries. You can fill out an application. You can actually start to map where these sites are. And because, as she said, there are probably tens of thousands of cemeteries like this across the nation. And they're using the very appropriate hashtag Black Graves Matter, which I think one of the things when we think about this, that this saying Black cemeteries are Black history, but Black cemeteries are also American history. And it's our history as well. And I think that part of what I feel is so wonderful about this work is the degree to which it is restorative, and it's really important and interesting work. And there are dogs involved. So I'm going to stop my share now and go ahead. And Sarah, were there questions?
Yes, we're getting questions. So one question is, how does the dense vegetation and repeated earth moving, for example, rotational timber plantations or agricultural fields, affect the ability of dogs to locate possible burials?
It's a terrible thing, and the fact is it affects them enormously. I remember Lisa Higgins telling me about a sort of a Mississippian indigenous site where they were working on one side of the fence, and she looked on the other side, and a farmer was tilling his field, and she could see bone fragments coming up. Those were from a Mississippian site, not African American. But the fact is that sites are being destroyed every day, right? I mean, for putting in suburban malls, and every time you put a new building in, there's a possibility. And so these are all things that make the work, I think, urgent, right?
Can you speak to any work being done regarding Indigenous graves at residential schools in the U.S.? This was asked by Victoria, who's from Canada, perhaps?
Yes. And Victoria, there is work that's starting to be done, and it's a really appropriate question, because this question was posed because of the schools in Canada, right, where First Nations children were forcibly removed from their families and put in these boarding schools. And I think that people noticed that there were, over the summer, graves were being discovered. And so I know that work is just starting in the United States. And again, this is such important work.
So we saw several different, breeds of dogs in your images. Are there particular breeds that are better at scent detection or better at being cadaver dogs, or does it mostly depend on the training?
It mostly depends No, it's both dog and training, right? The dog has to have a natural proclivity. It's easier to say what dogs aren't great. And I think a pug, or maybe, right, a super squashy nose. But I have seen so many different breeds, from pit mixes to Rottweilers and boxers to absolutely wonderful mutts, border collies, golden retrievers, Labradors do a lot of this work, both for disaster and for this kind of cadaver work. And shepherds and mals and mixes, right? They have to be fit enough to get around, and they have to really enjoy using their noses.
So, so William and Mary, with the Lumen Project, we've done a lot of research into our the African American people that William and Mary enslaved, and we spent a lot of time doing this research. We're working on oral histories. We're working on genealogy work. So, what do you recommend as the next step for us in locating possible burial grounds at William and Mary?
It's so complicated, Sarah. I mean, it's such a good question, and it's such a central question. It's like, when do you think it is sort of worthwhile to bring in dogs? What can dogs add? And the answer to that question is, dogs can't search hundreds of acres, number one. The importance of oral history and documentation cannot be overstated, right? This is where you get the stuff so that you can really start to see, right? So, but there's also the fact that even things like LiDAR, right, which is able to sort of strip vegetation away off of maps and get rid of that noise, where you can see tiny changes, right, on the land. That good LiDAR can be really helpful with this. So it's such a multidisciplinary thing to think about, right? If you have 5 or 6 areas where you suspect something might have happened, right, being able to sort of bring the dogs in might make sense. But if you think about at William and Mary, there's even things like records from the coroner, right? Wasn't there a funeral home that was very associated with William and Mary close by, right? Sort of like, so what's known about their records, and then can those records tell you something about where the enslaved might be buried?
In terms of how much these things cost, is it more cost effective to use cadaver dogs over other forms of survey like LiDAR, or are they used at the same time?
I think I think the answer to that is not, first of all, that it's not exactly my specialty, right? There are a lot of people who have cadaver dogs that might not be as highly trained as other people's cadaver dogs. So, so part of it is sort of the knowledge base that you're starting out from. And I feel as though these things, the order of these things is really depends, right? But the fact is that, for instance, in the case of this Maryland plantation, right? Scoping it out, seeing signs, bringing the dogs in, the dogs alerting, recording where those alerts are, then bringing in GPR, right? Because GPR is hard to use in woods like that. I mean, you're having to clear stuff out and everything else. And the GPR, in a sense, is the confirmation. What we call ground truthing, that would be disinterring, would be more confirmation. but ethically, that's really problematic. Thank goodness. And I think that except for exceptional cases, people aren't going to do that. So the issue is that once you get the GPR and have a really clear idea, then it's sort of back to the history books, right? To find out more, right? Like, who are the people there?
And if you have a dog and you want to be, be involved in this sort of work, what do you recommend that, people think about that and pursue it, or is it a very long process? I know you wrote about it in your book.
It is, Sarah, it is a very long process. What I would say about it is this, is that most of the people who are working historic human remains are people who have had cadaver dogs for other purposes. So these dogs are certified to do all different kinds of searches. And I think that that's really important, right? And so the process of certifying a cadaver dog and certifying yourself as a team can be super time consuming. There's just no doubt about it. And the fact is that all sorts of things can happen that make a dog not appropriate, or you not appropriate, or right. So it is a deep commitment. I currently do not have a dog that I'm working doing this. I'm just starting to train him, and fingers crossed, but I think it'll probably be another year and a half. Right. So it's a lovely thing, and people start to do things because they love them and they stick with them. And so I would never discourage somebody from doing that. And by the way, I did drop my email, and if somebody drops it in the chat, anybody is welcome to contact me about this. I think it's cat_Warren@ncsu.edu.
Yes, I just
thank you, Sarah. Thanks.
So we have a question related to you talking a little bit more about the kinds of sources used to locate initial ideas about burial ground whereabouts. So, is it usually official documents like maps, deeds, and other municipal records, or is it usually anecdotal evidence, or a combination of both?
It's a combination, and I think Juan would be able to even speak to this better, because the fact is that being able to sort of track this stuff is enormously complicated, and very often what we're seeing, I think, in cases where this really, really works, is that you have really dedicated community activists. So if you think about somebody like Kay, right, in Thomasville, Georgia, right, where she and Ephraim, the historian in town, they just went at it, right? She wanted enough money to put up a decent sign, right? And ultimately that project has just developed where new resources are coming in, and new people are going at the historical record, and that's what it takes. I think it can take years, and I think I'm trying to learn how to read land deeds and census records and slave schedules, and I think that I'm probably wasting a lot of my time throwing myself at it, because it can really be specialist work. I've had a couple people really help me. I'm deeply appreciative.
Well, let me know, and we're here.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
I think we have time for and Dr. Johnson as well. I think we have time for one more question. Are there certain environmental factors like soil types that help or hinder this type of investigation?
Yeah, that is such a huge and complicated answer. And I think that when you think about somebody like Blair Tarmay, who's a geologist, where soil type really matters. And there are places where soil is so acidic that that it can essentially dissolve stuff, right? And when I mentioned adipocera at the beginning, this what we call grave wax, familiarly speaking, is that in humid and wet environments that sticks around a long time, and that can really help in the location of much older remains. But in an environment like Arizona, right, that's going to disappear almost immediately. So yes, soil type and all of that matters enormously to being able to be successful with this work.
Well, just thank you so much, Kat, for doing this Lemons Legacies Porch Talk. We have learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to William & Mary possibly using cadaver dogs along with all the other tools that we are already using and can use to locate burial sites. Just really appreciate your time with us, and again, Kat's email is in the chat. So thank you so much, Kat. And we have some upcoming events with the Lemon Project. You can check them out on our website. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And you have anything to say, Kat?
Yes, thank you, Sarah and John and Terry Myers. I mean, the fact is that what you're doing at William and Mary is really so wonderful and inspiring. And thank you for doing that work. And have a good night, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming. Bye.